Mujahidin membuat perayaan di sebuah wilayah Taliban sejak kesepakatan antara AS Taliban diteken di Doha tanggal 29 Februari tahun 2020 lalu. Sebuah prestasi besar bagi semua warga Afghanistan, kata seorang komandan lokal. AS telah kalah dan sekarang kami telah memperoleh kebebasan kami, dan warga sipil bisa mulai merasa lega. Pesan perayaan ini adalah bahwa Taliban menyebabkan kekalahan historis AS. Tapi muncul perang lagi, yakni antar Afgan. Setidaknya 80 serangan telah dilakukan sejak hari Ahad, menewaskan puluhan orang terutama anggota pasukan keamanan pemerintah Afgan.
Triggered by Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani refusing to release up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners as guaranteed by the Doha Agreement. The Afghan government did not take part in that agreement and says this is a matter that should be negotiated during the upcoming intra-Afghan talks. The Taliban insist they must be freed before the negotiations start. They need the detainees to be freed sooner rather than later. The agreement has been criticized within the Taliban's ranks, and there are reports of fighters defecting to other groups like ISIL.
In the Doha conference, totally they are all the same, They have one theme, but inside there are differences. There are Taliban in Afghanistan, there are Taliban leadership in Pakistan, they don't agree. They go by clans and tribal systems, and also politically. There are Taliban who are trained and educated in one area, there are Taliban in groups who are educated in another area, even that has a difference.
The group feels it's now in a position of strength. Mullah Jalaluddin Shinwari says it has also evolved since the day he was Attorney General of the Taliban government in the 1990s.
The Taliban is definitely the winner, but before we ruled alone. That has changed. The Taliban wants to have a government that will include all ethnicities, but there are red lines. One is the withdrawal of all foreign troops and their advisors. The implementation of Islamic law is also a red line, because we paid a heavy price. But whether the country is called Islamic Emirates or not is open to negotiation.
Pemerintah Ghani ingin agar Taliban melucuti senjata setelah menyetujui gencatan senjata. Kemungkinan konflik akan terus terjadi selama masa negosiasi dengan AS ini. Afghanistan adalah perang terpanjang dalam sejarah Amerika. Setelah serangan WTC pada tanggal 11 September tahun 2001, Amerika dan sekutunya menyerbu negara itu. Taliban, yang memerintah Afghanistan, dituduh telah melindungi Al-Qaeda dan Osama bin Laden. Hampir 20 tahun kemudian, konflik masih berlangsung. Negara ini masih bergolak. Taliban masih mengendalikan sebagian besar area, dan perang tidak kunjung mereda.
So, levels of violence are enormous. In 2018, 25,000 people died in Afghanistan.
Jadi apa yang membuat Amerika tidak dapat menang? Afghanistan telah terperosok dalam konflik selama lebih dari 40 tahun. Pada tahun 1979 Uni Soviet menginvasi untuk mendukung rezim komunis Afghanistan. Sebagai tanggapan, Amerika mendanai mujahidin untuk melawan pasukan Soviet sebagai bagian dari perang proksi Amerika. Pada tahun 1989 pasukan Soviet menarik diri dari Afghanistan, yang memicu pertikaian bertahun-tahun di antara para panglima perang suku. Kekacauan menciptakan peluang bagi Taliban untuk menangkan kekuasaan. Dan pada tahun 1996, Taliban mengambil kendali atas Kabul, ibu kota Afghanistan, dan mengukuhkan diri sebagai pemerintah negara. 3 tahun setelah invasi Amerika pada tahun 2001, pemilihan demokratis diadakan di negara itu. Namun tidak ada penguatan militer atau pembicaraan damai.
So, every president in their own way has tried to win the war in Afghanistan. They've put troops in, they've taken troops out. None of them have really managed to fundamentally change the course of the war itself.
My fellow citizens, events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision.
President George W. Bush pulled resources away from Afghanistan to focus on his war in Iraq.
In one of the most difficult decisions that I've made as president, I ordered an additional 30,000 American troops into Afghanistan.
President Barack Obama put huge amounts of troops into Afghanistan to try and knock the Taliban into a deal, to try and win the war there.
And the American presence hasn't been all bad.
For all the good they've done, allowing girls to go back to school, creating a democratic government, there's no real sense in which much of that can survive beyond the period in which the Americans leave and the funds dry up.
Itu karena Taliban sekarang mengendalikan banyak area Afghanistan sejak tahun 2001. Hari ini hampir 18% dari semua distrik Afghanistan di bawah kendali Taliban. Dan 48% masih diperebutkan. Bagaimana Taliban bisa memperluas kekuatan mereka?
The Taliban don't have military might. They don't have warplanes or tanks or advanced equipment. What they do have is local legitimacy. They have persuaded many people that their version of swift Islamic justice is more legitimate than the corrupt Afghan government.
And they've been propped up by neighbouring Pakistan.
Some people will say Pakistan, which helped form the Taliban in the early 1990s, was too committed to helping their Islamist allies survive. They sheltered the Taliban leadership in Pakistan. They gave arms and weapons to the Taliban to help them gain support in Afghanistan. Efforts to destroy the opium crop effectively destroyed the livelihoods of farmers and in some cases made them more sympathetic to the Taliban.
And more hostile to the government the Americans installed after 2001.
People will say that the West created an overly centralized, domineering state in Afghanistan run by an overly powerful president who didn't pay attention to the ethnic, tribal, social heterogeneity of the country. I think all of these were reasons, but I think it's also the case that no big counterinsurgency campaign with lots of troops has ever really worked in a society like Afghanistan in recent years.
Is it time for America to leave? President Donald Trump has been trying to strike a deal with the Taliban to reduce the amount of American troops in Afghanistan.
Donald Trump kicked off the most serious negotiations between America and the Taliban that have ever occurred, only to have decided to walk away at the last minute.
As both parties were about to meet in September 2019, a Taliban attack killed an American soldier.
Donald Trump doesn't want to go into his election with 14,000 troops in Afghanistan. If America is seen to be in a rush, the Taliban will simply count down the clock until everyone leaves and they can take over Afghanistan.
If and when the Trump administration and the Taliban strike a deal, the worry is that Mr. Trump will quickly reduce troops in Afghanistan without securing lasting peace.
What's absolutely important is that the Americans and the international community are patient and they encourage a power-sharing agreement in Afghanistan between the Afghans, between the Taliban, that isn't cobbled together in a few months.
Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, talks between the government and the Taliban are still on hold as the country plunged into a political crisis after two rival presidents took oath, hindering prospects for lasting peace. The poverty rate in Afghanistan is rising. In 2012, 37% of Afghans were living below the poverty line. In 2020, over half the population does. So, as Afghanistan is still struggling on multiple fronts, has this deal been made in haste because the US wants to quit Afghanistan while avoiding responsibility for the consequences of its invasion?
Bagaimana pendapatmu? Silakan berikan tanggapan di kolom komentar di sebelah bawah. Tetap nantikan video selanjutnya. Aktifkan notifikasi dengan menekan ikon subscribe, ikon lonceng, dan ikon jempol. Terima kasih sudah menonton sampai akhir video ini. Semoga topik ini bermanfaat. Kami doakan semoga Anda sehat selalu. Oke, sampai jumpa lagi di video selanjutnya.